Okay, hi booktube, Aaron here, hope you're doing okay. Today I'm going to be wrapping up my reading for 2022, so I'll just be going through some like stats and things like that. I've got my Storygraph account up here on my laptop, so if you see me looking off to one side, I'm just going through there. I haven't worked out how to record my screen on my laptop, however I'll get some screen grabs and they'll be up here somewhere so you can see them. I've also got my top 5 books of 2022 plus a few honourable mentions. The first thing I want to do is just to look back at the goals I made at the beginning of the year and see how well I did. So the 4 goals that I set for 2022 were to read more translated fiction, and I put a particular emphasis on reading works translated from Russian. Then the second was to read more mammoths, so that's books that are more than about 600-700 pages, something like that. The third was to read more fantasy, and the fourth was to reread more books. So with the first goal that I made, to read more translated fiction, I'd say I did pretty well with that. So 33 of the books I read this year were translated from another language. That's just under half of the books really. Out of those 33 books, 8 of them were translated from Russian, which I'm quite happy with. It means I've managed to touch base with a few Russian writers, but I've also managed to read stuff from a few other places as well. So that's a goal I'm pretty pleased with. The other goal I'm pretty pleased with is the mammoths. So I managed to read 6 books that were more than 700 pages, which is pretty cool to think about actually, as sometimes it's quite hard to fit in just one book that's more than 700 pages. So yeah, I'm pretty pleased with myself with that goal. With the other 2 goals, I'd say that I managed to touch on them, but I didn't really achieve them, at least in my own eyes. So with fantasy, I managed to read Lord of the Rings, and I also read a short story collection called St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves, which many of the stories in there had a weird kind of fantasy element to them. But I think that's about it really when it comes to fantasy. So I'd say I touched on that, but I maybe didn't achieve that goal. And the same goes for rereads. I managed to get a few in there. Lord of the Rings was one of them. But ideally I would have quite liked to have got a few more in as well. But that's always going to be something in the back of my head. So it's I don't think rereading is going to be a conscious goal for 2023. If you want to see my goals for 2023, I'll pop a link up in the cards. But definitely rereading is going to be something that's in the back of my head, kind of nagging at my mind. So there are my my goals for 2022 and kind of how I did. Let's get into the stats themselves and sort of review my reading. So to start off then, just the number of books that I read. So according to Storygraph, I read 71 books this year. At the beginning of the year, I set my reading goal to be 50 books. It's a nice kind of round number for me. And then at some point in the year, it must have been around maybe September, October time, I managed to reach that goal of 50 books. And so I pushed it up to 60, and then I even surpassed that and got to 71. However, I am going to deduct 3 books from that total. And that's because, well, firstly with Lord of the Rings, I'm just counting that as 1 book, so that's deducting 2, and then the other will be In Search of Lost Time, or Remembrance of Things Past by Marcel Proust. I read the first 2 volumes, which according to the edition that I read is 1 book on Storygraph, but as I see it, it's just the first 2 volumes of a longer novel, so again I'm going to deduct that as well. But still, 68 is a good number, and I think it is more than I've read in any given year. In terms of pages I've read 24,022 pages. I think I set a goal of 18,000 pages, and I didn't really update it, but yeah, that's a pretty good, I think that's a pretty good achievement, at least for me. And I mean, I'm not too sure how accurate that is, because sometimes the editions aren't quite the same on Storygraph and on Goodreads, and sometimes you can't find the exact edition that you're reading, but as a rough estimate, I think that's pretty good. The next little thing here on the stats on Storygraph are the moods of the books that you read. And so every book kind of has its own moods on Storygraph, and after you've read a book, you can, in your review, you can kind of check off what moods you thought were represented in the book. And so according to Storygraph, the most represented mood in my reading this year was reflective. So 45 of the books I read this year were reflective. 22 of them were challenging. 15 of them were emotional. And then a couple of other contenders would be dark, adventurous, and mysterious. So yeah, I think that's a pretty cool representation for my reading. The next little pie chart here is reading pace, or the pace of the books, I suppose. So the majority of them that I read were slow-paced books, which I don't mind at all, so a good 64%, which is 42 books. Then a healthy chunk of them were medium-paced, so that's 32%, and that's 21 books, and only 5%, so only 3 books, were fast-paced. Next up is page number. So the majority of the books I read were under 300 pages, a good 56%, so that's 40 books. Then 27%, so 19 books were between 300 pages and 499 pages. And then 17%, so 12 of the books I read were more than 500 pages long. The next pie charts, I won't say I have issues with, but I think it's going to be a little inaccurate, and that's it's a pie chart for sort of fiction, the kind of the ratio of fiction and non-fiction that I've read. So here it says 75% fiction and 25% non-fiction, and just the only little gripe I have is when it comes to reading poetry. On Storygraph, it's kind of hard to classify, exactly what it is. So sometimes poetry is put down as fiction, sometimes poetry is put down as non-fiction, and so it's kind of quite hard to actually see really how accurate this graph is, particularly with the amount of poetry that I read. But as a rough glance, I'm kind of happy with that. I do enjoy reading a lot of fiction, and maybe reading a little more non-fiction would be something worth doing in the future. The next one is a graph of the genres that I read, and just looking down on the left hand side as I scroll down, it's pretty much got almost every possible well, not quite every possible, but a good number of genres there. So it starts off with classics, there's poetry, literary, short stories, historical, history, fantasy, magical realism, horror, romance, science fiction, plays or drama, philosophy, contemporary, speculative fiction, reference, nature, art, LGBT, I always forget QIA+, sorry the writing is a bit small, can't quite see, travel, religion and mystery. So I'm kind of touching base on quite a few things, it would seem. However, the high contenders right at the top there are classics, poetry and literary, which is pretty accurate, I would think. Then there's one for format. It says 100% print. I did read, I think just one book actually as an ebook this year, so I think that's something I should really improve with. And then this is one I find quite nice. This is most read authors. So number one here is J.R.R. Tolkien. It's counting each of the the books of Lord of the Rings, and I did spend a lot of time with Tolkien this year. Then there's Albert Camus. I read 2 books by him this year. Maria Stepanova, I read 2 books by her. Laszlo Krasznahorkai, again 2 books by him. I read 2 books by T.S. Eliot, and I also read 2 books by William Shakespeare. So that's quite a nice collection of writers there. I think they'd quite enjoy all hanging out with each other. All the books I read this year are in English, because I can't really read in any other language. And then this is one of my favourite graphs. Again, not too accurate, because it's really to do with when I'm tracking my reading and not the pages I've read. But it's looking at the number of pages and the number of books that I read throughout the year. So the red line you can see are the pages, and then the blue line is the number of books. So you can see it started off quite slow in January. I think that's because I had a bit of maybe option paralysis at the beginning of the year. I was reading quite a lot of things at once, and I'd set these goals for myself. So I think I was feeling the pressure a little bit. And then it sort of amped up a little bit in February, and then it went down a little bit in March. But I think around then I was reading for the Booktube prize and reading a couple of other things as well. It went down again in April. I think that's because I was just concentrating for a lot of time in April on getting War and Peace finished. And so I might have not been reading loads and loads and loads of things. And then it sort of boosts up again. But you can see for most of the year it kind of tends to stay at around the 2,000 pages a month mark. It jumps up in November up to nearly 3,000 pages. I don't think I really read quite that number. I think you could deduct maybe about maybe 300 pages. I think about 200 pages, and that's because I picked up Borges's collected fictions. So I kind of put it down and took it off my sort of currently reading books so at some point earlier on in the year. So a good sort of 200 pages probably should be attributed to January or February. And then you can see that in December it kind of just jumped down again to about 1,500 pages. And December was just a bit of a busier month for me, so I wasn't able to get quite as much read, but I did enjoy what I read in December. And then I think the last one here then is star ratings. And so on Storygraph, it splits up the star ratings sort of into quarters, and so it gives you a little more, just a little more room, I suppose. So my sort of average rating is 4.19 stars. So you can see I've awarded quite a few books 4.25, and nothing's really got lower than a 2-star rating. Maybe that's me being a little too kind with a couple of the books, I don't know. But yeah, nothing got lower than 2 stars. Only 7 books got a 5-star rating from me. And a few got close with 4.5 and 4.75. So yeah, it tends to stay around the 4-star mark for me. And just a few books get the 5-star. So there you go, there's sort of my year in reading at a glance, I suppose. But before I go, I'll go through my 5 favourite books of 2022. And there's also a couple of things that I forgot to mention in my goals video as well, which I'll let you know about before the end of the video. So let's go through my top 5 books of 2022. So in at number 5 is Beloved by Toni Morrison. It was my first Toni Morrison for quite a while. It's been a few years since I'd read anything by her, and just a few pages in, I just kind of got this feeling that, yeah, this is why I read, this is what I love about reading. just about the voices that she manages to make, the kind of physicality of what she's portraying, and just the real kind of honesty of her writing, I think, is really what stood out to me. So yeah, I really, really loved Beloved by Toni Morrison, and maybe in 2023 I might read a bit more by Toni Morrison. In at number 4 is Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. Again, quite similar to Toni Morrison. Hardy is a writer that I've loved in the past and just haven't read for a little while. And this was a very bleak book, but a really, really wonderful book as well. And I just felt so deeply for the characters. I just thought what Hardy was doing here was amazing. I made a review of this, which I'll try to have linked in the description. Number 3, and all of these are sort of 5-star books for me. Number 3 is In Memory of Memory by Maria Stepanova. This is a really, really weird book. It was in the translated fiction division for the Booktube prize this year. I think really, if you're being totally honest, it really should be in the non-fiction division. It's really a collection of essays and it's family history. But again, you're not really too sure how much of it is sort of honest family history, and how much she's inventing or kind of fictionalizing. So I can kind of understand why they might want to have put it in the non-fiction or in the translated fiction division. But this is one of those books that it's just really, really hard to kind of put what you feel about it into words. All I can really say is just read it. But for me, it was just a really wonderful experience, and I need to reread it a number of times, I think. Next up is The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. This is just an amazingly immersive book. You just fall into its world and just want to stay there. And really it's a kind of microcosm of Europe at the time, but it's kind of set apart from history. It's its own little society, and then history kind of then intervenes. So yeah, a really, really wonderful book. Yeah, there's nothing else I've read that's quite like it. And then my number 1 for 2022, which shouldn't be too much of a surprise, I don't think, is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. This just really, really blew me away. It's one of those books you find really intimidating before you read it. But as I started reading it, I just really fell into it. It's split up into these really quite short chapters, and so you can make progress on it, relatively quite quickly, for the size of the book. But just again, the immersive nature of the book is amazing. It feels like more real than real life, and I don't think it's necessarily, the characters do feel real and you do become really attached to them, but there's kind of something more to it. There's a realism that's more than realism, and I think it's the experience of reading it. I think it just kind of becomes your life in a way. So yeah, my number 1 book would be War and Peace. And if you want to hear more about War and Peace, a lot more, Chris from Leaf by Leaf has just put up like a 6-hour long review of War and Peace, which I'm at the moment currently making my way through, but it's been a real joy to see him give it the full treatment. And then I've got 3 honourable mentions. So these were books that I love but just didn't quite make the top 5 list for me. So I've got The Complete Stories by Franz Kafka. I think part of the reason why it didn't quite make the cut was because with any collection of stories, there are stories you really love, and then stories that you think are kind of okay, but just aren't that special something. Yeah, I really enjoyed spending time with Kafka this year. Next up is A Chess Story by Stefan Zweig. This is just a perfect short story or novella, just a great portrait of obsession, kind of breaking into madness, I suppose. But yeah, really, really great story. And then my last honourable mention is Memorial by Alice Oswald, and this is, she describes it as an excavation of the Iliad. So she's really just taking the similes and the descriptions of people's deaths from the Iliad, and that's about it. So it's, you know, very, very thin. She's giving it her own kind of treatment, but it's just a really, really wonderful work of poetry. I'm quite sad that this is really the only book of poetry I've really mentioned in my favourite books and my honourable mentions. I suppose it is quite hard to evaluate a book of poetry. It's, again, similar to the like short story collections and things like that, and really the thing you evaluate is the individual poem. Really, it's quite hard to evaluate the whole thing. So in mind of that, I think in this year, periodically throughout the year, I'll do a few sort of poetry recommendation videos. I'll be recommending poets, recommending collections, but giving you also individual poems by those poets or from those collections as a kind of springboard, just so people can see what they're like. So I'll do that periodically through the year, maybe only a couple of times, but that's something that I'll be trying to do in 2023. And then before I go, there's just one sort of goal or one thing that I want to do this year as well that I left out of my goals video, and that's going to be that I'm just going to track the number of books that I buy this year, just as an interesting, you know, little thing to do, just to see how many books I buy, and then I can measure that against the number of books that I read. It'll just be an interesting thing to see. But there we go. That's everything that I wanted to cover this year. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing more and more sort of yearly wrap-up videos here on booktube. So that's everything for today, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.